Rochester Heights was the first post-war subdivision built by African Americans that was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. It came from freedmen's land. So right after the end of the Civil War, it was some of the first land available for sale by African Americans. And one of the families that are very important to the history of Rochester Heights is the Lightner family. Lightner, who created Lightner Arcade in the early 20th century and is one of the few safe spots moving through the South between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia, in addition to Chavis Park and a few other places, but also the first Black mayoral candidate in the city of Raleigh came from the same family. It's a funeral home family, so the early wealth of a lot of Black communities in that part of Raleigh came from those kinds of services during the Jim Crow era. Rochester Heights is right next to another community called Biltmore Hills. Both were built on what they thought was higher ground adjacent to Walnut Creek, the Walnut Creek watershed. And in Hurricane Floyd, that land flooded severely because the dam that created Lake Raleigh on NC State's Centennial campus blew out, and all that water rushed from NC State's campus down into this community and flooded. At the time, there was a very famous resident of that neighborhood, Dr. Norman Camp, who was a Southeast Raleigh native, a native of this particular area, got a degree from NC State, got degrees from Shaw University, very prominent individual who in that moment organized what was known as Episcopalians for Environmental Justice, which later became Partners for Environmental Justice. It was founded at an Episcopal church, which still stands there, St. Ambrose Episcopal Church, because that same flood and same storm flooded a community in northern Raleigh along the Crabtree Creek. And Raleigh was really founded on the high ground between Crabtree and Walnut, sort of how it's divided. But Walnut Creek, North Raleigh, predominantly white community, the city agreed to make infrastructure changes to kind of address the storm damage, just as a part of their due diligence in Crabtree Creek, but wanted to create a special assessment for the Walnut Creek people affected that would eventually accumulate into enough resources to make infrastructure changes. And they saw that as unjust. So Dr. Camp and many others built this multiracial coalition that pushed back against that special assessment, which they defeated. But they also took another step and said, well, hey, what if we identified the closest, most intact forested wetlands in downtown Raleigh as an important natural, but also cultural asset, so that people in the region would understand the value of forested wetlands as they function within the regional water system, but also the cultural heritage, because for many years that land was important land for African Americans, farmland, agricultural land, and then culturally moving into the 20th century. And they were able to sort of track the regional land use changes that contributed to flood events, the exacerbation of flood events, namely going from agricultural land to impervious surfaces with suburban sprawl, rooftops and parking lots and that sort of thing. So they kind of ad hoc, as a community, generated this really powerful regional analysis that said, look, we are actually facing not just this particular flood event, but we're facing sort of unjust land use and transportation policies that make us more vulnerable, not less, to flooding events. So they pushed for a bond issue for the designation of Walnut Creek Wetland Park and what was then known as the Walnut Creek Wetland Education Center, which was designed and built in the early 2000s and opened and welcomes tens of thousands of people every year. They host a lot of educational programming, have been doing that particular work, and they're in the process of implementing the Wetland Park now. Walnut Creek Wetlands is the largest, healthiest, most important forested wetland closest to the center of Raleigh. It's that way because the transformations have been happening in the community, but through the advocacy for generations of African Americans in Southeast Raleigh, led by Dr. Norman Camp, but carried on today through Partners for Environmental Justice. Raleigh is changing significantly, particularly South Raleigh, and all of those changes will impact Walnut Creek, its health, and its people. From Dix Park, which seems benign, the large 300-acre urban park, but we know will fuel economic development all its edges. South Saunders Boulevard, where downtown South is occurring, but a much more intensive program that risks displacing the oldest African-American subdivision in Raleigh and its connections to the creek. So ecologically, economically, and politically, there's an opportunity to embrace this place, celebrate it as a part of our shared heritage and history, advocate for its protection, and influence the developments that are surely going to shape its future.